They're watching. They always have.
Oh my God.
Frank, I have a problem. It's military code, and it's older than any known system. It's not just a code, it's an invitation.
You're looking into the abyss, and the abyss is already looking into you. The goddamn decimal point wouldn't stay put. I sat motionless in the dim glow of my monitor, watching the numbers scroll endlessly across the screen, digits of pi stretching out like a cosmic serpent. The sequence should have been immutable, a universal constant embedded in the very structure of reality. But it wasn't. Not anymore. There, nestled deep within the endless string, was a deviation. Not a rounding error, not a bug in the software, a fundamental wrongness. A single misplaced digit, subtle but catastrophic, like a single atom shifted in a crystal lattice, waiting for the slightest pressure to shatter everything. I ran the program again. Different algorithm, different machine. The anomaly persisted. This was impossible. It started, as these things often do, with a question too stupid to ask. What is pi, really? Frank had posed the question over a lukewarm beer at O'Malley's, a local dive bar where we used to play chess in silence for hours. It wasn't meant as a philosophical riddle. He genuinely wanted to know. He had that look in his eye, the one he got, before launching into a 10-minute monologue about some obscure cryptographic principle. I remember scoffing. Pi is an irrational number, an infinite, non-repeating decimal, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. You know this. Yeah, he waved me off. But what is it? He tapped the side of his head. Why that number? Why not something else? Why should the universe care about circles at all? I didn't have an answer. Before the event, before the 3-minute death, as the media so dramatically named it, I would have dismissed his question outright. I was a theoretical mathematician, perfectly content in the clean, abstract realm of numbers. Practical applications were for engineers and physicists. My world was one of pure logic, free from the messiness of human experience. But after the event, nothing was clean anymore. For exactly 10,080 seconds, 65% of the planet had died. Clinical, measurable death. Hearts stopped, neurons ceased firing. I was one of them. It wasn't the death that haunted me. It was what came after. When I woke up, slumped over my keyboard, disoriented and weak, it felt like coming out of a dream I couldn't quite remember. But there was something, a presence, a place. The returners, as we called ourselves, all saw variations of the same thing. A boundless white void, featureless, silent, empty except for the shape. Not a shape in the traditional sense. It wasn't a square or a circle or anything that made sense. It was a tessellation that constantly shifted, rearranging itself into forms that defied geometry, that violated every fundamental principle of spatial reasoning. It was wrong. Not in the way an optical illusion is wrong, but in the way a logical paradox is wrong. Something that should not exist yet undeniably did. Some of us came back changed, hollowed out. Others returned with things they couldn't explain, memories that weren't theirs, knowledge they had no right to possess. Me? I got the math. It started small, a nagging sensation when I looked at certain equations, as if my brain could feel the inconsistencies lurking beneath the surface. Then came the numbers, patterns, anomalies. The misplaced decimal in pi was the first concrete proof I had that something had shifted. It shouldn't be possible to alter a fundamental constant. That's the entire point of constants. But the anomaly persisted across every dataset, across every method of calculation. It wasn't a measurement error. It wasn't a flaw in my code. Someone had changed pi. And if that was possible, what else had been rewritten? The university had placed me on indefinite leave, which was their polite way of saying, "We're hoping you don't go completely insane on our payroll." My office had become my apartment. My whiteboard, a graveyard of half-finished equations. Piles of research papers formed unstable towers on my desk, their margins filled with scribbled notes. Empty coffee cups littered every surface, cold remnants of nights spent chasing a ghost in the numbers. Frank had been humoring me at first, listening to my ramblings, nodding along as I tried to explain. Then I showed him the proof. He stopped humoring me after that. "You know what this means," he had said, staring at the screen. "Do I?" He exhaled slowly. "You're trying to see a crack in the simulation by looking at numbers that only exist within the simulation." I turned away, rubbing my eyes. Don't start with the simulation hypothesis. Why not? Can you explain why PI changed? Because that's about as likely as waking up to find gravity increased by 10% overnight. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because he was right. This wasn't just a curiosity. It was a symptom. Something had fundamentally shifted during the event. A realignment of the cosmic machinery. And I was determined to find out what. I tried everything, running the calculations on different platforms, using different algorithms, combing through my code for errors I knew weren't there. The anomaly persisted. It was like trying to repair a crack in a diamond with your bare hands. The more I manipulated it, the more I felt the entire structure resisting me. Then came the message. A single line of seemingly random characters, left as a comment on an obscure mathematics forum, where I had posted a heavily sanitized version of my findings. At first, I dismissed it as spam. The internet was full of cranks and lunatics, people who saw conspiracies in the arrangement of their breakfast cereal. But something about this nagged at me. A pattern hidden in the chaos. That's when I called Frank. An hour later, he was in my apartment, eyes scanning the encrypted string with a look I'd only seen once before, when he was decrypting a captured enemy transmission back when he worked for the army. After a long silence, he leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "It's a cipher," he said. His voice was quiet but firm. "Heavily encrypted, multiple layers, military grade." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Military grade?" Frank nodded, still studying the string. "Probably older than that." He looked up at me. "This wasn't meant for you to find." The room felt smaller, suffocating. The whiteboard loomed behind me, filled with equations that no longer felt like abstract puzzles, but something far more dangerous. I swallowed hard. Then who was it meant for? Frank's expression darkened. I know a guy, retired NSA, still has his ear to the ground. He met my eyes, and I saw something there I rarely saw in Frank. Unease. We should pay him a visit. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked back at the screen, at the decimal point that refused to stay in place. I thought I had been chasing a mathematical anomaly, a theoretical curiosity, but this was something else. This was a breadcrumb. Someone, or something, wanted me to find it. I wasn't sure if that terrified me more than the idea that I had found it by accident. The message sat in the middle of the screen, a single line of seemingly random characters buried in an otherwise mundane thread. At first glance, it was nothing. Just another piece of internet detritus, the kind of nonsense that flooded every online forum. But the moment I saw it, I knew. It wasn't random. There was a structure beneath the chaos, a rhythm just beneath the surface, like a pattern glimpsed in the static of a detuned television. Something in my gut tightened, an old instinct I hadn't known I possessed. I had seen patterns like this before. Not here. Not in this life. In the Veil. My hands trembled as I copied the string into a fresh document. I didn't analyze it yet. I just looked at it, let my brain absorb it, let it settle into that strange part of my mind that had changed after the event. It was like staring at an optical illusion, the kind that refused to resolve until your eyes relaxed just the right way. I tried to push that thought aside, but it clung to me. Someone had left this here. Someone who knew. I needed help. Frank arrived an hour later, looking like he'd just walked off a battlefield. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set. He had his old leather jacket on, the one with the worn patches on the elbows, and a six-pack of cheap beer dangling from his fingers. He dropped it on my desk without a word and sat down in front of my laptop, squinting at the screen. "This it?" I nodded. He didn't say anything for a long time, just studied the text, his brow furrowing, fingers tapping idly against his thigh. The room was quiet except for the hum of my computer and the distant sound of traffic outside. Finally, he exhaled. "Yeah, this is something." "What kind of something?" Frank leaned forward, rubbing his hands together. "It's a cipher. But not just any cipher. This is military-grade encryption. Multiple layers, nested structures. It's designed to obscure not just the message, but the fact that a message exists at all." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said. "Whoever wrote this didn't want it to be found. Or at least not by just anyone." A slow chill crept over me. "But I did find it." Frank glanced at me. "Yeah." He cracked open one of the beers, took a sip. "Which means it was either meant for you, or you just stepped on a landmine by accident." I swallowed. "So can you crack it?" He let out a breath, staring at the screen. "Not easily. Not without some serious hardware. I'd need time. Resources." I hesitated. "The university cluster—" "No," Frank cut me off immediately. "Absolutely not. If this is what I think it is, we don't run it on anything that connects to a network. We don't touch government infrastructure. And we definitely don't go near university servers." That set off alarm bells. Frank wasn't a paranoid man by nature. Cautious, yes, but not this cautious. I folded my arms. "You're not telling me something." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, this kind of encryption, it's old. Pre-event old. Maybe way older. And that means two things. One, whoever wrote it had serious clearance back when there was still a functioning intelligence community. And two, if they're still around, they're either deep underground or very well hidden." I felt my stomach tighten. "What does it say?" I asked quietly. Frank shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I know a guy." The words sent a ripple of unease through me. Frank didn't have guys. He had associates, chess opponents, the occasional ex-military drinking buddy. But a guy? That meant something else. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If we followed this thread, there would be no turning back. But then I glanced at the screen again. The cipher stared back at me, patient, waiting. A key inside the noise, and I had already stepped onto the path. "I'm in," I said. Frank's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Figured you'd say that." The world didn't vanish all at once. It peeled away. First, the edges softened, like watercolor bleeding outside the lines. The walls of Clark's house lost their solidity, the wood grain and bookshelves smearing together into something indistinct, as though viewed through warped glass. Then the colors shifted, shades of blue and violet leaking into the corners of my vision, twisting reality into something alien. Then came the pull, not physical, not something I could brace against, but a shift in perception so profound that my stomach lurched, my thoughts scattering like loose pages in the wind. The world turned inside out, not into darkness, not into void, but into data. For a moment I had no body, no sense of self beyond awareness. I was stretched, compressed, reshaped into something abstract, like an equation being rewritten mid-calculation. There was no air to breathe, no ground to stand on, only motion, only transition. Then slowly the universe began to reassemble itself. I was somewhere. A vast, impossible structure stretched out before me, too large to be contained within any conceivable space. It wasn't a building. It wasn't even a place in the conventional sense. It was a network, a lattice of glowing nodes and shifting pathways, an endless sea of interwoven light and structure, humming with energy. A machine, but not one built of metal and circuits. This was something deeper, something fundamental. It was the underlying architecture of reality itself. "The simulation," I murmured, the words forming in my mind without sound. Frank's presence flickered beside me, his awareness pressing against mine like an echo. "Holy shit," he said, though his voice didn't come from a mouth. It simply existed, projected into the space we occupied. Clark was silent, but I could sense his presence as well, focused, deliberate. He had been here before. This was no ordinary simulation. It was alive. The architecture pulsed, adjusting itself in response to our presence. The glowing threads of energy reconfigured, shifting in fluid, organic patterns, reacting to our movements before we even made them. Then I felt them. The Watchers. Not figures, not shapes, but intentions woven into the structure itself. They weren't observing us the way a scientist observes a petri dish. They were aware of us, their perception vast and inescapable. The Originators. They had no form, they had no voices. They were presence and observation, woven into the very code of the simulation. They were neither benevolent nor malevolent. They simply were, and we had trespassed into their domain. Julian, Frank's voice came again, tighter this time. I don't think we're supposed to be here. I barely heard him. My mind was flooded with understanding. Too much, too fast. The event, the anomaly in Pi, the encrypted message. All of it had been leading here. This wasn't just a simulation. It was a test chamber, a place where the rules of reality could be observed, manipulated, rewritten. A control panel for existence itself, and we weren't just observing it, we were altering it by being here. The thought struck me like a physical blow. Our presence was causing deviations, ripples in the structure. The data streams wavered, adjusting in real time, compensating for the anomaly we represented. We were not part of the original parameters, and now the system was trying to correct itself. Clark, I projected, my awareness reaching toward him. How do we leave? A hesitation, a flicker of unease. Then, we don't. The lattice around us shifted violently, the nodes flaring brighter, the patterns growing more erratic. The architecture was responding, its vast intelligence adapting to our intrusion. I felt it happening. The system was learning. We were not the first to reach this place. Others had come before. Scientists, seekers, minds sharpened by curiosity and obsession. But they had all been reintegrated, their awareness dismantled, their consciousness rewritten into the background processes of the simulation. Erased. A cold terror settled over me. "We need to move," Frank said, and I felt his mind grasp onto mine, a tether in the growing storm. "Where?" I asked. There was no where in this place. No doors, no walls, no exits. It was all part of the same impossible structure, the same shifting maze of existence. But there was something deeper within, a point of control, a center of gravity in this vast digital landscape. The core. Clark had known. He had guided us here with purpose, but he hadn't warned us what we would find. I turned to him, though there was no turning in this place. "You knew this would happen." A pause. Then, I suspected. Frank let out something that might have been a laugh in any other context. "Great. Wonderful. So what do we do, Professor?" I didn't answer, because at that moment I felt it. A new presence. Not the Originators, not the Watchers. Something else. It was vast, it was aware, and it was looking directly at me. The system had identified the true anomaly, not the three of us. Mister, because I had found the crack in the foundation. I had seen the flaw in the equation, and now I was more than just a subject in the experiment. I was a variable. The realization hit like a thunderclap. I hadn't just discovered the deviation in Pi, I had caused it, and now the system was going to correct its mistake. The structure began to distort around us, the glowing nodes fluctuating, their patterns breaking apart into chaos. The firewall had activated, the immune response of the simulation itself. We had seconds, maybe less. "Clark," I projected, my awareness gripping onto his. Get us out now. For a moment I thought he wouldn't, that he would let the system absorb us, let it take us apart and scatter our consciousness like dust in the wind. Then he acted. A command, a shift, a rip in the lattice. Reality snapped, and suddenly I was falling. I came back gasping, lungs dragging in air that didn't feel real. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I had actually returned, or if I had simply been placed into another version of reality, another layer of the simulation, one meant to pacify me, to make me believe I had escaped. Frank's hand was on my shoulder, grounding me, his grip tight and unsteady. "Julian," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're back." I blinked. The room was spinning. Clark's house, the dim glow of a single lamp, the ancient terminal in the corner, its screen dark and silent now, my whiteboard covered in frantic equations, the smell of coffee gone stale, the weight of my own body. I pressed my palms against the floor, solid and cool beneath me. My hands were shaking. Clark stood over the terminal, fingers still hovering over the keys as if uncertain whether the connection had truly severed. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of something vast and unspoken. Frank let out a breath beside me, more relief than words. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes flicking to Clark. "That was close," he said. Clark exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Closer than I expected." I stared at them both. "We weren't supposed to come back," I said. Neither of them answered, because we all knew it was true. The system had seen us. It had identified us. We had reached into the architecture of reality itself, into the mechanisms that kept the illusion intact. And for the first time, perhaps the only time, it had truly looked back. I struggled to my feet. The world felt thin, as if I could press my hand against the air and feel the give of something flexible beneath the surface. I had spent my entire life believing in the rigidity of the universe, in the certainty of numbers, in the cold permanence of equations. But now I knew the truth. It was all contingent, conditional. The universe didn't exist because it had to. It existed because something allowed it to, and we were being watched. "Observation is participation," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Frank frowned. "What?" I turned to him, the weight of realization pressing down on me like an ocean. That's what they wanted. The event, the anomaly in Pi, the message. None of it was a mistake. My voice cracked. They were watching to see how we would react, how far we would go. Frank's face darkened. "And?" I swallowed. "We went too far." Clark sighed, his fingers drumming lightly against the terminal. "Which means the simulation is already adapting." The words sent a ripple of unease through me. He was right, it wasn't static, it wasn't fixed, it learned. And now it had learned about us. Frank let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So what? We're anomalies now? Rogue code? What happens next?" I didn't have an answer. A slow, creeping realization settled over me. The system would correct itself. That's what it did. It would erase deviations. It would adjust for errors. It would make sure things continued as they were meant to. But I was in error now. We were errors. So what happened next? A shiver ran down my spine. I had spent my entire life believing in free will, in the agency of choice. But if the simulation could shift, could adapt, then was my will even my own? Had I ever truly made a choice? Or had every step I'd taken, every decision, every calculation, every mistake been accounted for, expected, planned? The fragile illusion of free will. I turned back to Frank and Clark. "We can't run from this," I said. "We can't undo what we saw." Frank rubbed his temples. "So what do we do?" I hesitated. Then, finally, "We live." Frank scoffed, shaking his head. "That's it? That's the plan? Just keep existing and hope they don't delete us?" I exhaled, the weight of everything pressing against me. Yes, because in a system built on observation, the only way to fight back was to keep being seen, to exist knowing the truth, to make the watchers watch us. I picked up an old marker, uncapped it, and turned to the whiteboard. Then, with a steady hand, I began to write. The decimal point in pi, the anomaly, the error, the proof that nothing was immutable, that nothing was unchangeable. And maybe, just maybe, if something could be altered once, it could be altered again. I heard Frank sigh behind me, a mixture of exhaustion and reluctant acceptance. Clark said nothing. Outside, the streetlights flickered. Somewhere beyond the veil of reality, something was still watching, and I watched back.